There is a saying among the old spacefaring cultures whispered in 100 different tongues across 100 different worlds: never test the quiet ones. On the planet Velkasheri, that saying was carved into stone above the entrance of the Xenobiology Institute. Nobody remembered who wrote it there or why. They just knew it had been there for 400 years, and that lately it had started to feel less like folklore and more like a warning. The story of what happened on Velkasheri began, as most galactic catastrophes do, with a very confident scientist and a very stupid assumption. Dr. Ren Kathe had built her entire career on predator behavior. She was a skarn, one of the tri-jawed apex hunters from the Corvasi Reach, a species that had clawed its way to the top of its own food chain and then kept climbing until it ran out of things to eat. The skarn did not fear much. Their planet's ecosystem had produced things with acid blood and razor cartilage, and the skarn had eaten all of them into extinction out of what could only be described as professional pride. So when Dr. Koth was assigned to head the Interspecies Threat Assessment Division, nobody blinked. She was, by every metric the galaxy used, the perfect predator to study other predators. Her current obsession was humans. Specifically, her obsession was a question that had been quietly driving the scientific community insane for the better part of a decade. Why did apex predators across dozens of documented alien ecosystems refuse to attack humans? It made no sense. Humans were slow, they were soft, they had no claws worth mentioning, no venom, no natural armor, no camouflage, no echolocation, no ability to survive extreme temperatures. On paper, a human being dropped into almost any hostile alien biome should have lasted a matter of minutes before becoming lunch for something with more teeth and less conscience. And yet, the footage had been trickling in for years from colony worlds, exploration outposts, and first contact survey teams. A human researcher walking through a swamp on Threl Minor, while a 12-foot apex amphibian watched from the reeds and did nothing. A human engineer repairing a fence on the edge of a game reserve on Doskovi, while a pack of horned pursuit predators circled at a distance, agitated, snarling, but never closing. Every single predator species cataloged so far had displayed the same bizarre behavior. They would stalk humans, they would posture at humans. They would sometimes even test the air near humans, clearly hungry, clearly capable, but they would not bite. The scientific community had produced no shortage of theories. Some believed humans carried a chemical marker, some kind of pheromone that alien nervous systems interpreted as toxic. Others believed it was purely behavioral, that human body language somehow triggered ancient predator instincts to avoid a fight not worth having. A few of the more mystically inclined researchers, mostly from cultures that still practiced ancestor worship, whispered that humans were simply marked by something older and stranger than biology. Dr. Kathis found all of these theories intellectually lazy. She believed there was a simpler explanation. She believed no predator, in the sample data, had actually been hungry enough, desperate enough, or bold enough to fully commit to an attack. She believed the data was incomplete because the sample size of genuine bite attempts was effectively zero. She intended to fix that. The species she selected for her definitive experiment was called a Voth Karik, and it was by every metric her institute could measure the single most dangerous apex predator ever cataloged in known space. The Voth Karik was native to a border world called Ashgar Deep, a planet so hostile that it had killed 11 of the 14 survey teams sent to study it before anyone managed to bring a live specimen back for observation. The creature stood 4 meters at the shoulder. Its hide was a lattice of overlapping bone plates that had shrugged off small arms fire in the field reports. Its jaw could exert enough pressure to crack duracrete, and its 4 eyes operated across separate spectrums, meaning it could see in total darkness, through smoke, and through most forms of camouflage available to prey species. It had no natural predators. It had never lost a recorded confrontation with anything, including other Voth Kariks. Xenobiologists across 6-star systems referred to it, without irony, as the perfect killing machine. Dr. Ka had spent 11 months acquiring a specimen for controlled study. She had spent another 4 months designing what she called, in her official grant proposal, a behavioral confirmation trial. Everyone else on the project called it, quietly, The bite test. The setup was simple. A reinforced observation chamber, 3 meters of transparent alloy separating the human volunteer from the Voth Carrick enclosure, cameras running on every angle, full biometric monitoring on both subjects, and a release mechanism that would, on command, remove the barrier entirely. The human volunteer was a man named Elias Ruiz. Elias was not a soldier. He was not a scientist, not a diplomat, not anyone of particular galactic importance. He was a maintenance technician for the Institute's environmental systems, 41 years old, quiet, unremarkable in every way that mattered to the people around him. He had taken the job on Velkasheri 8 years earlier after his wife passed, back on Earth from an illness that no amount of money or medicine had been able to stop. He did not talk about her. He kept a small photograph of her, taped inside his locker, and he ate lunch alone most days, and he fixed things that broke, and he went home to a small apartment that echoed with a silence he had stopped trying to fill. Nobody at the Institute thought much about Elias Ruiz. He was the sort of person other species tended to overlook entirely. A background figure in the grand theater of alien science, notable only for showing up on time and never causing problems. When the request went out across the Institute for a human volunteer to participate in what was described as a low-risk observational study on predator avoidance behavior, Elias signed up without asking many questions. The pay was good. The paperwork said low risk. He needed the money for a shipment of parts he wanted to send back to his sister on Earth, and he figured standing behind 3 meters of reinforced alloy while some alien creature looked at him through glass sounded like an easy way to earn it. He was not told in any of the consent documentation that Dr. Koth's true intention was to eventually remove that barrier. The Voth Carrick arrived at the observation chamber on a transport rig, sedated, and the entire research wing turned out to watch it get moved into position. Even sedated, it was enormous. Its bone plating caught the light in dull, ugly gleams, and its breathing alone rattled the observation windows. Elias stood on the other side of the alloy barrier in a jumpsuit that was not remotely rated for combat, holding a tablet with his authorization codes on it, waiting for the study to begin, entirely unaware that he had become the single most important experiment in the history of interspecies threat assessment. The first 3 days were, by Dr. Cothy's own notes, disappointingly uneventful. The Voth Carrick woke from sedation, oriented itself, and immediately located Elias through the barrier. It did what every other apex predator in the historical record had done. It stared. It postured, rising onto its hind legs and unfurling the bony crest along its spine that other researchers had documented as a dominance display used before killing blows. It paced. It made a low, subsonic vibration in its chest that had been measured in previous specimens as a precursor to a hunting strike. And then it simply stopped. It retreated to the far side of its enclosure, folded its massive body down against the floor, and watched Elias with an expression that, if the creature had been capable of anything resembling human emotion, might have looked uncomfortably close to unease. Dr. Cathy watched the footage on repeat, increasingly frustrated. The behavior matched the pattern exactly. Posture, assess, retreat. It was the same avoidance response she had watched 100 times in 100 different species, and she had come to genuinely despise it. She began adjusting the parameters of her experiment. She reduced the creature's food rations, reasoning that hunger would eventually override whatever strange instinct was suppressing the attack. She introduced stress stimuli, sudden loud noises, flashing lights, minor electric current through the enclosure floor, all designed to agitate the Voth Carrick into an aggressive state. She even, in a decision she did not fully document in her official reports, ordered the sedation of Elias himself during 2 of the sessions, reasoning that an unconscious human target, unable to respond to threat displays, might finally trigger the predatory strike she was looking for. Did not work. The Voth Carrick grew visibly more agitated with each passing day, snapping at the walls of its enclosure, slamming its bulk against the barrier hard enough to spiderweb the alloy in places. But every single time it drew close enough to strike at Elias, it hesitated, backed away, and resumed its unsettled crouch on the far side of the chamber. By the second week, 3 separate junior researchers had filed internal complaints about the direction of the study. Dr. Keith dismissed all of them. She had spent 11 months and an enormous portion of her grant funding on this specimen, and she was not about to let a starving, agitated predator continue to disprove her thesis simply because it lacked the courage to commit. She began drafting a new proposal. If the Voth Carrick would not initiate contact voluntarily, she reasoned, then the study would simply need to force contact and observe what happened afterward. She would remove the barrier entirely for a controlled window of time under full restraint protocols that could pull Elias out the moment any bite connected. She framed it, in her documentation, as the final necessary step to complete a decade of inconclusive galactic research. She did not ask Elias whether he wanted to participate in this revised phase. She simply scheduled it. Elias found out about the change the morning of the trial when a research assistant handed him a revised waiver form to sign on his way into the observation wing. He read it twice. He asked, in his usual quiet, unremarkable tone, whether the barrier removal had been approved by anyone above Dr. Kaw's authority. The assistant, a nervous young researcher who clearly did not want to be having this conversation, told him that Dr. Kathes had emergency override authority for time-sensitive behavioral studies and that the paperwork was, unfortunately, already filed. Elias looked at the form for a long moment. He thought about the shipment of parts for his sister. He thought about the quiet apartment waiting for him at the end of each day. He thought briefly, the way he sometimes did without meaning to, about his wife's photograph taped inside his locker, and the particular kind of silence that follows losing someone you built your whole life around. Then he signed the form. Nobody in that research wing understood, in that moment, what they were actually looking at. They saw a maintenance technician. They saw an unremarkable man in an ill-fitting jumpsuit, signing away his safety with barely a flicker of hesitation. They did not see what he had already survived to get here, the illness that took his wife, the years of grief he had carried across half a galaxy without once asking anyone for pity, the quiet, stubborn resilience that had kept him upright through all of it. They did not see the sleeping giant standing in front of them. They only saw the outline of a man they had already decided did not matter very much. The trial was scheduled for the following morning. Dr. Kath arrived early, reviewing her instrumentation with the calm satisfaction of a scientist who believed she was hours away from settling a question that had haunted the field for a decade. She checked the restraint cabling that would, in theory, allow her team to physically pull Elias backward the instant contact was detected. She checked the biometric monitors, strapped across his chest and wrist, designed to flag any dangerous spike in heart rate or cortisol. She checked the Voth Carrick's feeding schedule, confirming that the creature had gone the better part of 5 days without a full meal. She did not check, at any point, whether Elias himself had eaten that morning or slept the night before or wanted to speak to anyone about what was about to happen to him. In her notes, he was subject to a necessary variable, a biological constant she needed in order to solve for the unknown. The observation gallery filled with researchers, more than had attended any previous session. Word had traveled through the institute that Dr. Keith was finally removing the barrier, and scientific curiosity, mixed with something closer to morbid anticipation, had drawn a crowd. Elias stood in the chamber in his jumpsuit, restraint cabling clipped to a harness beneath his clothes, biometric leads taped along his collarbone. He looked to the researchers watching from the gallery exactly like what they had always assumed he was. Small, soft, profoundly out of his depth. He looked across the chamber at the Voth Carrick, which had gone still and low against the far wall, its 4 eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made even the seasoned researchers in the gallery shift uncomfortably in their seats. Dr. K.A.'s voice came over the internal comm, flat and clinical, beginning barrier removal in 10 seconds. Elias did not move. He did not run to the chamber door. He did not shout for the trial to be canceled. He simply stood where he was, hands loose at his sides, breathing slow and even, watching the creature watch him. The barrier retracted with a low mechanical hiss. For 3 full seconds, nothing happened. The Vothkarik remained crouched against the far wall, its massive chest rising and falling, its 4 eyes locked on Elias with an expression the researchers in the gallery would later struggle to describe. Not hunger. Something closer to dread. Then, hunger won. 5 days without food had done what a decade of instinct had resisted. The Vothkarik surged forward across the chamber floor with a speed that defied its enormous bulk, bone-plated legs driving it into a full charge, jaw unhinging wide enough to swallow a human head whole. The restraint cabling snapped taut, yanking Elias backward off his feet. But it was a half-second too slow. The Vothkarik's jaw closed around his forearm. The gallery erupted into chaos, researchers shouting, alarms blaring, Dr. K screaming orders into her comm for emergency extraction, as the restraint team hauled desperately on the cabling, trying to drag Elias free before the creature's jaw finished what it started. The bite lasted, according to the official chamber footage later reviewed by the Galactic Council, exactly 4 seconds before Elias was pulled clear, his arm torn open, blood streaming down onto the chamber floor in a spreading dark pool. He did not scream. He grunted once, low and controlled, the sound of a man absorbing pain rather than surrendering to it, and as the restraint team hauled him back through the resealing barrier and into the observation corridor, he looked down at the mangled mess of his own forearm with an expression that unsettled every researcher who saw the footage afterward. He looked almost apologetic, almost like he felt bad for what was about to happen to the thing that had just tried to eat him. Inside the chamber, the Vothkarik released its bite and staggered backward, shaking its enormous head. At first, the researchers in the gallery assumed it was simply reacting to the restraint team's electrical deterrent, a standard non-lethal countermeasure built into the chamber floor. But the shaking did not stop. The Vothkarik's massive body began to tremble, its breathing turning ragged, thick ropes of saliva swinging from its jaw as it staggered in a widening, uneven circle. Dr. Kathes, still shouting for a full lockdown, stopped mid-sentence when she saw the readouts scrolling across the enclosure's internal biosensor feed. The Vothkarik's core temperature was spiking. Its heart rate, already elevated from the chase and the strike, was climbing into numbers the sensor software flagged in red, numbers that did not correspond to any documented physiological range for the species. Its blood chemistry readout, pulled from a secondary sensor woven into the enclosure flooring, was scrolling error after error, unable to process the values it was receiving. The Vothkarik's legs buckled. It hit the chamber floor with a sound like a dropped transport container, its enormous bulk shuddering, its 4 eyes rolling wildly as foam gathered at the corners of its jaw. The gallery went silent. Dr. Kathes stood frozen at her console, staring at the readouts, watching the single most dangerous documented predator, known space convulse on the floor of a containment chamber it had, by every physical metric available, been fully capable of destroying. Within 90 seconds the convulsions slowed. Within 2 minutes, they stopped entirely. The Vothkarik lay still on the chamber floor, its massive body finally quiet, its 4 eyes open and unseeing, killed by a single bite wound inflicted on the very creature it had just tried to eat. Nobody in that gallery moved for a long time. Dr. Kathe was the first to break the silence, her voice thin and unsteady in a way none of her staff had ever heard from her before. Pull the full biological workup, now. The medical team that treated Elias in the Institute's emergency bay found him remarkably stable, all things considered. The bite had done significant damage to the soft tissue of his forearm, torn muscle, a hairline fracture where the jaw pressure had cracked bone, deep lacerations that would need extensive grafting. But he was conscious, coherent, and according to the attending physician's notes, disturbingly calm. When the physician, a Discovery trauma specialist named Farun, Yale, asked him how he was feeling, Elias reportedly looked down at the heavily bandaged mess of his arm and said, in a flat, dry tone that Farun would recount for years afterward, that it could have gone worse. He asked, almost as an afterthought, whether the creature had survived. When Farun told him it had not, Elias simply nodded, the way a man nods at weather he had already expected, and asked if someone could bring him something to eat. While alias recovered in the medical wing, the biological analysis of the Voth-Carex remains produced a set of results that would ripple outward across the scientific community of the entire galaxy within days. The creature had died from massive systemic toxic shock, combined with an overwhelming bacterial sepsis response, triggered entirely by exposure to the bite wound itself. Human saliva, it turned out, hosted a staggeringly dense and varied microbial population, a byproduct of an evolutionary history spent as an omnivorous species that had, for the vast majority of its existence, eaten with unwashed hands, cooked meat over open fire, and survived generation after generation of exposure to pathogens that would have killed almost any other species outright. Human blood, meanwhile, carried a chemical signature the Voth-Carex biology had utterly failed to recognize or process, a cocktail of proteins and immune compounds that, once introduced directly into the Voth-Carex own bloodstream through the bite wound, triggered a catastrophic and irreversible physiological collapse. In simpler terms, the report concluded, the most dangerous predator ever documented in known space had died because it bit a human being, and the human being's biology was quite literally poison to it. Dr. Koth read the full report 3 times before she believed it. She had spent a decade convinced that humans avoided predation because predators, across dozens of species and biomes, were making some kind of behavioral miscalculation, underestimating an easy meal out of misplaced caution. She realized, staring at the toxicology data scrolling across her console, that she had inverted the entire question. The predators were not making a mistake by avoiding humans. They were the only ones in the entire galactic scientific community who had correctly understood the danger. Every apex predator across every documented ecosystem that had encountered a human being had, on some instinctive ancient level, recognized something the galaxy's most advanced research institutions had spent a decade failing to identify. They recognized a creature that did not need claws or venom or armor, because it carried something far more efficient, stitched into its own blood and breath. They recognized, in other words, exactly what kind of world had produced a species like this. The footage from the observation chamber, along with the full biological analysis, was submitted to the Galactic Council's Threat Classification Division within 72 hours, at the direct and unusually urgent request of the Institute's Oversight Board. The Threat Classification Division had, for decades, maintained a 5-tier system for rating the danger level of inhabited worlds, primarily used to advise trade routes, colonization efforts, and diplomatic contact protocols. Tier 1 worlds were considered safe for unshielded travel. Tier 5 worlds were considered so hostile to outside life, the travel was banned outright, except under extreme scientific necessity, with full environmental sealing required at all times. Earth, prior to the Voth-Carex incident, had been rated Tier 2, mildly hazardous, notable for aggressive wildlife and unpredictable weather patterns, but broadly survivable for short-term visits by prepared travelers. The council session convened to review the Velkashari footage ran for 11 hours. Dr. Koth herself was called to testify, presenting her data with none of the confident authority she had carried into the project 11 months earlier. She stood before the assembled council delegates, representatives from 43 member species, and described in clinical but unmistakably shaken terms exactly what her research had actually proven. She explained that human beings were not simply avoided by apex predators due to some minor chemical deterrent or behavioral quirk. She explained that human beings, biologically speaking, were walking biohazards to almost every other form of alien life documented in galactic records. Their immune systems had evolved across a planet with some of the highest recorded pathogen density of any inhabited world ever surveyed. Their blood chemistry carried compounds capable of inducing fatal toxic shock in creatures many times their size and strength. Their very saliva, an evolutionary byproduct of an omnivorous diet and a long history of surviving infection, functioned as a delivery mechanism for that toxicity. She explained finally that the vothkorik, a species with no natural predators, a species that had never once lost a documented confrontation with anything in its 400 years of catalogued observation, had died in under 2 minutes from a single bite wound, inflicted by an unarmed maintenance technician who had not even tried to fight back. The council chamber, according to the official transcript, remained silent for nearly a full minute after she finished speaking. The delegate from the Threll Compact, a species whose own apex predators had been quietly avoiding human contact for years without explanation, finally broke the silence by asking the question that would end up defining the entire session. If their predators will not even attempt to eat them, the delegate asked, then what precisely are we choosing to classify as prey? The vote to reclassify Earth was not close. Within the week, Earth's threat rating was elevated from Tier 2 directly to Tier 5. The same classification reserved for worlds considered too biologically hazardous for unshielded travel. The Council's official reasoning, published in the updated Galactic Registry, cited, among other factors, documented cases of extreme and unpredictable microbial toxicity in native biological fluids, an apex predator mortality event directly attributable to human physiological contact, and a consistent, cross-species pattern of predator avoidance. Behavior now understood to reflect accurate threat recognition rather than any form of deterrence failure. In plain terms, understood almost immediately by every trade route, captain, colonial administrator, and diplomatic envoy. Across known space, humans had just been formally reclassified from a mildly inconvenient nuisance species into something closer to a biological weapon that happened to walk around wearing clothes and asking for directions. The footage from the Institute leaked publicly less than a month later, despite the Council's attempts to keep it classified, pending further study. It spread across 100 different networks, translated into dozens of languages, watched and rewatched by a galaxy that had, until that point, largely regarded humanity as a curiosity, a species notable mostly for its stubborn persistence and its complete lack of any obvious evolutionary advantage. The reaction across most of known space was not fear exactly. It was something closer to a deeply uncomfortable recalibration. Trade negotiations involving human-populated systems began, including, almost overnight, extensive new clauses covering biological contact protocols. Tourism boards on dozens of worlds updated their guidance for visiting humans, quietly suggesting that direct physical contact, particularly involving open wounds, be avoided wherever possible. A popular Doscovy comedy program built an entire segment around a sketch where an alien bureaucrat frantically read new safety guidelines to a visibly unbothered human tourist who simply shrugged and asked if the buffet was still open. Back on Velkashari, Elias Ruiz spent 6 weeks recovering in the Institute's medical wing, his arms slowly healing under a treatment regimen that, according to Farin Yell, was made considerably easier by the fact that his immune system appeared to actively resent the idea of getting sick. He received, during those 6 weeks, an unusual number of visitors. Dr. K that came to see him on the 9th day, standing awkwardly at the foot of his medical bed for a long moment before finally speaking. She told him she owed him an apology. She explained, in halting, uncharacteristically unsteady language, that she had spent 11 months treating him as a variable in an experiment rather than a person with a say in his own safety, that she had allowed her own professional pride to override basic ethical judgment, and that she had, in the process, nearly gotten him killed chasing a thesis that had turned out to be backwards from the moment she conceived it. Elias listened to the entire apology without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking down at the bandaged mess of his arm. Then he told her, in that same flat, dry tone he seemed to default to under pressure, that he appreciated the apology, but that she should probably be more worried about updating her paperwork than about how he felt about the whole thing, because the next volunteer might not be quite so understanding. Dr. Caith, despite everything, found herself laughing, a short, surprised sound that seemed to catch her as much off guard as it did him. She asked him, before she left, why he had signed the revised waiver that morning, knowing full well what removing the barrier could mean. Elias considered the question for a long moment. He told her that he had already lost the thing that scared him most, a long time ago, back on a planet a very long way from here, and that ever since then, most other fears had a hard time competing. He did not elaborate further, and Dr. Kotha did not ask him to. The Institute, in the aftermath of the Council's reclassification decision, underwent a significant restructuring. Dr. Kate's behavioral confirmation trial project was formally shut down, replaced by a far more heavily regulated research division, focused on human physiological study, conducted under strict ethical oversight and, crucially, full informed consent protocols that actually meant something. Elias was offered, somewhat to his surprise, a permanent position on the new division's advisory board, specifically to help ensure that future human research subjects were treated as people rather than data points. He accepted, mostly. He told Ferroniel over a slow recovery word dinner one evening, because somebody needed to make sure nobody else got handed a waiver form on their way in the door without understanding exactly what they were agreeing to. He still worked maintenance 3 days a week. He said the quiet suited him. The photograph of his wife stayed taped inside his locker, exactly where it had always been. Dr. Kaith, for her part, published a revised and considerably more humble follow-up paper roughly 8 months later. This one focused not on why predators refuse to attack humans, but on what that refusal actually revealed about the nature of instinct itself. She argued in the paper's closing section that perhaps the most sophisticated form of threat assessment in the known galaxy was not found in any research institute's data models, but in the ancient, wordless calculation, running quietly through the mind of every apex predator that had ever laid eyes on a human being and chosen, against every hunting instinct it possessed, to simply walk away. She dedicated the paper to the one predator that had not walked away, and to the man who had survived it anyway. The Voth Carrick's remains were, at the request of its Native Ecosystems Conservation Council, returned to Ashker Deep for burial, an unusual honor typically reserved only for specimens of significant scientific or cultural importance. The Council's official statement noted, with a kind of somber, understated respect, that the creature had died discovering something that had eluded the combined scientific institutions of 43 member worlds for over a decade, and that its death, however unintended, had fundamentally reshaped the galaxy's understanding of an entire species. It seemed, the statement noted, like the least they could do. Years later, the incident on Velk Ashery would be taught in introductory xenobiology courses across a dozen different education systems, typically alongside a simple, understated warning that instructors delivered with varying degrees of dry humor, depending on their species and temperament. The lesson was always some version of the same idea. Every ecosystem in the known galaxy had, at some point in its evolutionary history, produced something it called an apex predator, a creature so dominant, so perfectly adapted to violence, that nothing else in its environment dared to challenge it. Earth had produced something different. It had produced a species so thoroughly saturated in pathogens, so casually resilient, so quietly unkillable by the ordinary rules of biology, that its own planet's deadliest predators had learned, through millions of years of instinct, to simply leave it alone. And it had taken one very confident scientist, one very unlucky apex predator, and one quiet, grieving maintenance technician who had already survived the worst thing life could throw at him, to finally prove it to the rest of the galaxy. The stone above the entrance of the Velkashari Xenobiology Institute still bore its old inscription, the same one that had been there for 400 years, the one nobody could quite remember the origin of. Never test the quiet ones. Someone not long after the reclassification vote quietly added a second line beneath it, in smaller, hastily carved letters, as though whoever wrote it wanted the warning to be complete, especially the quiet ones from Earth. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell so you don't miss the next tale of humanity's strange, stubborn, and occasionally horrifying place in the galaxy. Let me know in the comments what you would have done in Elias's position and whether you think the galaxy finally learned its lesson. There are plenty more stories like this one waiting. Until next time, keep your eyes on the stars and maybe think twice before you take a bite out of anything you don't fully understand.